So, welcome to this edition of the Rule Breakers podcast. And with me today is Simon Son Laurent. How are you doing, Simon?
Doing well. I've got a cat in my lap who's making sure everything is great.
All podcasts need cats. I think they should be mandatory.
For the internet.
Uh, Gosh, we haven't met in so long. I think we met on a cruise ship. I think there was an XML Geek cruise many years ago. I seem to remember that you
Yes.
and I were on. But I remember meeting you before that at various SGML and XML related things. In my head, there was a period of time there where there were a lot of conferences, SGML conferences in cold winter months in places like Boston. And I seem to remember that we met at a few of those. You wrote a book on XML called the XML Primer, or the Primer, as I think you might refer to it. That's part of that was the Charles F. Goldfarb series, wasn't it? The Prentice
No, it
Hall.
wasn't.
Oh, it
I, I
wasn't.
was I was my own strange thing for MIS Press actually at the time.
Oh, okay. I think it was around the same time that I did my first
Yes.
XML book.
We had really similar timing, and it made me very happy to see the number of books on the shelf get bigger.
Right.
And the bookstores would actually carry these things and not just be like, yeah, that's special order weirdness.
Yeah. But I guess when I think of you, I always think of DocBook.
Okay.
Because I know DocBook is something that you were involved in. I know you spent quite a few years at O'Reilly, didn't you? And O'Reilly were big proponents
Yes.
of that.
Although I was there after Norm Welsh had kind of created all the things.
Right.
I
Well,
was there. I mean, when I was doing DocBook at O'Reilly, it was more as a user of DocBook.
right.
Norm had built some amazing systems with a team of people where we had a lot of connections between DocBook and Framemaker.
Okay.
Eventually we had systems that were more taking in DocBook and going directly to other formats, PDF and other necessary publishing tools. Um, Around the time I was leaving, they had made a shift so that they were focusing on generating HTML rather than
Okay.
DocBook, and then they were formatting it uh, mostly with CSS. Um, but all of those tools were built on the DocBook tools. So
Right.
yeah, that DocBook legacy at O'Reilly definitely ran deep
Yeah.
even after Norm had moved off to Sun. So
And
yeah.
I associate that kind of era with the with CD-ROM publishing in particular. I used to come across DocBook quite a lot in say legal publishers who were using some good way to produce huge volumes of stuff on CD-ROMs that typically would have like monthly or quarterly update cycles. So you got a new CD in the post every quarter. And DocBook seems to be the weapon of choice in many of the organizations that were kind of building publishing systems to generate CD-ROM folio views. I don't know if you remember a thing called folio views.
I mean, part of why I was enthusiastic about XML when I ran into it was that the CD-ROM I had worked on was in Asymmetric's toolbook. And it was all custom built. It was called the Electronic Accountant. It was for a company that had realized that accountants had more CD-ROM drives than anyone else. They
Right.
assumed that this meant they wanted a full-on multimedia experience rather than, tax forms.
Absolutely.
Um,
Right.
so we worked like crazy to put this thing together. It was like interviews and multimedia and documents, but the documents were all RTF. And yeah, there was so much. I don't even want to go into what we did to make the search engine work, and I'm not honestly sure it really did work, which is kind of painful and sad. Um, but yeah, after doing that kind of weird handcrafted mess, I mean, I'd done HyperCard before and liked it, but that was a much smaller set of projects, and I wasn't trying to tell this bigger set of stories. Coming from that and then getting into HTML, XML, seeing what SGML could do, it was such a relief.
Right. As you say, we found a huge uptick in interest in in CD-ROM publishing in the accounting community and in the legal community. Because even though by today's standards, it was quite a small amount of storage. What was it, 600 megabytes or something? It was still a boatload of documents. You could easily fit the complete statute book of most jurisdictions, complete with a bunch of case law and stuff, all on one CD-ROM. And the killer feature of it, as you say, tended not to be things like multimedia. It tended to be search, how fast you could find stuff.
Yeah.
And that went on for quite some time, even after the web came along. I remember the accountants and lawyers were quite fond of their CD-ROMs for quite some time.
It was also nicely stable for them. So if they had, the 1988 tax forms, they were always going to be the 1988 tax forms.
Right.
Yeah, there were a lot of virtues to those shiny.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you raised, because it's one that occurred to me much later than it should have. That I'd be in a lawyer's office or an accountant's office, and I'd see a stack of old CDs. And not really realize just how powerful that was, because essentially it was like having a time machine on your wall, right? Because you could go back to a previous moment in time, which is something that's actually terribly important for a lot of lawyers and accountants and, some other folks who do that kind of work also. And that's kind of one of the things that went away. Although a lot of benefits came in with the World Wide Web, but like one of the things that went away was that like easy ability to just transition back in time.
But general sense of permanence is also gone.
Right.
I love the law libraries with the books everywhere, and it's amazing. There's one in a courthouse near me that I think has been sitting there since the 50s without any major adjustments.
Right.
And it's just kind of, it looks glorious. It probably is less exciting to browse unless you're a historian. But knowing that that's still captured there, someplace I have a book on like the New York State 1893 or 98, I don't remember, Constitutional Convention, and the changes that they made to the document. And I'm not even sure that's one that passed, but it was still published as a book.
Right.
And so you can always find these things. I've always loved that aspect of the physical device world. I do everything mostly these days in the digital world, but it's still good to have permanence.
Taking you back, if I can, back to the use of electronic tools to produce paper books. Obviously, that was a big part of O'Reilly's original business model. I remember the days of the X Windows system, the X11.
Yeah.
And
those books were all done with TROF. Those were well before.
They were TROF books, were they? Okay.
Yeah. And again, I think Norm Welsh was involved in those. John Levine, who's also oddly 10 miles away from me, was involved in a lot of TROF stuff. And if I have the story right, a lot of DocBook originated as TROF macros.
Oh, really? Okay.
Found their way. Okay, this is what we're doing. We can map that to SGML and then to XML. It sounded like the evolution changed once it moved out of like the TROF universe to the markup universe, because you could have more people, different categories of people discussing what these things should be and what the structure should be. But every time I turn around, I feel like I find that technologies have deeper roots, even when they're supposedly new and radical.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest one of this for me was looking through the SGML handbook and finding the sample vocabulary that Charles Goldfarb had stuck in there. And a lot of that became HTML just because it was there. And
yeah.
It's not a one-to-one match, but it's a lot of it.
One of the things that always intrigued me about TROF, this came up actually on the last podcast I did was with Peter Flynn, when we were talking about his history of using a PDP-8 computer, I think it was, with TROF on it. Now, my understanding of the history of the evolution of Unix in Murray Hill, New Jersey, in AT&T's research labs, was that the brief from management was to produce a publishing system. But because they
Oh,
were
okay.
super smart individuals, they said, well, in order to do that, we'd need to have a good operating system. And in order to do that, we'd need to have a good programming language. So they invented on Unix and C, in order to deliver management, a typesetting system called TROF. I don't know if that's true or not. I hope it's true. I love the story.
I love the idea. Whether or not it's precisely true, it's okay.
Yeah, yeah. But
Um,
what was baked into TROF that I thought was just really, really clever when I saw it was the whole idea of the pipelines. So, for example, processing tables was a separate process called TBL, I think it was, and equations was EQN. Um, and then these separate autonomous processes could get chained together with the pipelining that was built into Unix, essentially to build what what are now known as publishing pipelines.
so they do need to build an operating system. So
There you go.
you have Unix pipes. Yeah,
There you go. And I guess in today's terminology, we'd now call TBL and EQN agents, and because
perhaps. Yeah.
it's specialized processors. But it was a really intriguing model. And you mentioned it was Norm Walsh who did that. Um, did he? Well, presumably there was a desire to move away from TROF though that resulted in the transition
Yeah,
to a
I know there was a lot of relief as they moved away from TROF.
okay,
Um, and I think Framemaker was sort of an attempt at an intermediate zone where we could work in DocBook,
right,
but also have the graphical
right,
FrameMaker. I say PageMaker.
Framemaker, yeah,
Um, so we went through a lot of different phases.
right. The FrameMaker thing always intrigued me because it speaks to something that's been close to my heart in all of this is that um, the benefits of having all of your data in some sort of structured format, especially these days, componentized
Mhm.
structured format. The benefits, as the volume of content goes up, it becomes more and more and more and more critical. And if you've got that, you're actually, in a very good place to do all sorts of clever things with the content. However, um, if the content gets there through some sort of author edit systems, like some sort of subject matter expert who has to pour the content into the system, that's historically where I've seen um, the kind of beautiful XML or SGML story kind of falter a little bit, right? Because the subject matter experts don't necessarily know or care anything about
Yeah.
any of that, right? They're just trying to get their content, out of their heads and into the computer. I'm wondering if that might have had something to do with the FrameMaker plus SGML thing, because it does give you a kind of a WYSIWYG type way of working, with a side effect of producing content at the back, I guess, that's in structured form to some degree.
Yeah. I didn't
Uh,
have a lot of instructors, I mean, not instructors, authors actually working in FrameMaker,
right,
but for our like internal editorial teams,
right,
it definitely made it easier to find people who could
right,
copy edit these things and go through these things and enter changes into these things. So,
right, right.
um, yeah, I mean, I feel like this is part of the story that we never quite finished is the editors for markup.
Mm,
We've had all of these rounds of tooling. I'll confess that when I work on markup, I generally just go to a text editor because
mhm.
I can do that. Even though I know most people don't love that, I can totally do it. I sort of have the markup built into my fingers memory.
Fingers, right,
Closing tag, no problem. All of these things, yeah.
all right.
But not everybody's like that. This kind of boundary between like subject matter experts or
Mm,
people who have to manipulate have to polish the content. Polishing is frequently very difficult. Uh,
right,
and then those of us for whom markup is a normal thing, it's there was a brief moment when HTML was kind of taking off, and suddenly lots of people were learning, what markup looked like and
mhm,
how to make these things go. Yeah, I remember I was on a mailing list that's mostly out of New York that was just people who were really enthusiastic about creating websites with these strange less than, greater than, slash, what are we doing here? Kinds of stuff. And um, lots of detailed conversations about, how best to make this look and tools they were using. And I think everyone used BB Edit at some point or another. Um, and it just seemed for a moment there like people were happy to like pop off the covers of the machine and work closer to the details. It wasn't that close. The browser was still doing a huge amount of work. And
Mm.
as anybody who then went to write an HTML editor quickly learned, there was still a lot between the visual representation and the markup.
Right.
Um, but briefly, there were people eager to work directly on the
Right.
markup. It was a marketable skill. It was kind of perversely fun.
Mm.
Um, and it was really just much more flexible than any of the other options we had. So,
Right. 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 I confess I did spend a lot of time in the early days, um, working on documents in Emacs, just using a whole bunch of Emacs macros and stuff to do the tagging. But yeah, straight, working directly with the tags. But one of the things that I remember really impressed me about Framemaker was it was the first time that I realized that um tell you a story.
sure.
At one stage, I met someone at it was some sort of training course run by Sun Microsystems in the UK. I can't remember the context, but someone was talking about the fact that they needed to get a machine with more RAM, um, because they couldn't hold the entire document that they were working on in memory. This was an SGML document, I believe.
Mhm.
I can't load, takes ages to load the entire document into memory. And I remember at the time thinking that, um, well, if the largest document we can ever work on is always a function of the amount of memory we have in the computer, there's probably something a little bit wrong about how we're thinking about it. And then when I saw Framemaker, the light bulb went off, right? Because or turned on, should I say? Because it was, in Framemaker, the paradigm was there are things called books, and
Right.
books contain subcomponents called chapters. And I remember thinking, aha, that's clever. Um, I know in my head, I don't know whether you think this analogy holds or not. It's like, DocBook was a stepping stone towards DITA in some ways, in that it started the process of decomposition, but it kind of stopped one level down. You got as
Yeah.
far as there are chapters, whereas if you want to think of it, I guess, in more DITA type terms, you can just keep going with decompositions.
Yeah. I think we've seen similar things on the HTML side as well. I mean, web
Right.
components has not taken off supremely well, but and there are way too many endless nested divs in the universe. But um, that sense that I can take this piece and I can move it over here and I can create my own design vocabulary, or that I can reuse these things and I can run them across print and online and a weird mobile interface.
Right.
Once you have it componentized, all the possibilities open.
Right. Indeed. Yeah. Yeah. And I guess jumping forward a little bit to what's going on in our world today, um,
Mhm.
um, it looks as if having your data, your document content, your knowledge, call it what you will, in a componentized format, which, as you say, had lots of benefits for things like, mobile devices and multi-channel delivery and so on, as I think they call it. Um, but now here we are in this new AI world, and it looks as if having components, or what the AI folks tend to call chunks, um, is a very good starting point for various clever things that you can do with AI. So part of me thinks we might actually be uh, entering the golden age for componentized content by accident, if you will, in the sense that people who are going to be ahead of that game, um, leveraging their internal content in clever ways with AI, are the ones who componentized it for reasons other than AI, if you know what I mean. Because they've been doing the componentization for years.
A lot of it is about finding the connections between the components.
Right, right, right.
I mean, I think when I think about kind of the large language model thing, I almost think they throw away our componentization to get their, giant mass of things.
Mm.
But the ways that we can make that work better, more accurately, like all of the techniques for focusing those tools on the data we have and the ways to use them,
Mm.
it all centers on that componentization. Like,
Yeah,
how do I really express to this enormous body of language
right.
what I want? How do I keep it focused on what I'm doing? How do I keep it from saying rude things about my competitors or about me,
Yeah,
or, you know, um, anything you're going to do to enhance that experience does require that you've done all of this extra work setting up your data, uh, making sure that your information is accessible to these tools in the right way.
mm,
Um, some of it happens like during the training phase, reinforcement. Some of it happens when you're just trying to put together meaningful prompts, um, and they're, RAG and a lot of other techniques are uh, depending on us having these pieces.
right, right,
Um, one thing that's a little odd is that I don't AI can do markup, but it's never been a priority. It's not really built into the logic. It took a lot of effort, for example, to get large language models to produce consistent JSON,
right,
never mind nested markup. Um, that's still something that's more about other kinds of logical processes, whether they're
mm,
coming from us or from our databases or from our other tools.
right,
Um, so I think there's still a long ways to go to not so much to feed the systems and get them to say coherent things, but to take advantage of the componentization that we're talking about as
right,
output side, to uh, make it easier for people to interact with these things.
right,
Uh, I think a vast number of people were incredibly happy to have, kind of the Star Trek style prompt,
right.
computer, do what I want.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, but it has its own limitations. And a lot of the ways that we use to make it fluid are basically by creating ever longer prompts and
right,
sort of hiding that. We don't see the full prompt, which has
right,
history.
right,
Uh, um, I think we're just getting started figuring out how to do that effectively.
right,
Um, and some of the best systems that I've heard of are using other sources of information to build
right,
all of that and then get something meaningful out of it.
right. Yeah,
So,
absolutely,
yes, you're right. All of the stuff we've done, all of the stuff we're doing is still very useful,
absolutely.
even though it's not always front and center.
Right,
Um,
right.
but it's what makes it work rather than just look like it's working.
And you mentioned structured documents and LLMs. One of the things I was blindsided by, to be honest, was is realizing that a bunch of these LLMs were starting to develop, insofar as they do structured documents. The structured document capacity that they're building tends to be circled around Markdown
Yeah.
more than angle brackets.
Yes.
Uh,
Markdown and JSON are easier to generate.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't know if you've had if you've been using any of those tools that infer hierarchy, decomposing, for example, a PDF document into component pieces. I've been pretty impressed with a bunch of what I've seen, but it is all Markdown that you end up getting back out. But as you know, it's a short hop to get from Markdown into some sort of angle bracket universe if you
Yeah.
need it. But
When I was writing for Pragmatic, they actually have I think it's pragmatic markup language or something, but it's a mixture of markup and markdown,
okay,
which can occasionally be confusing, but it is
right,
absolutely possible to blend these things and have them work together.
right. I'm wondering if we might see some sort of initiative uh, to enhance Markdown for the things that it's missing rather than the other way around, if you know what I mean. Because
Yeah.
it does look as if it's got a head of steam right now.
Yeah, when I was at O'Reilly, we did a lot with ASCII Doc, which
Okay.
in my head is really Markdown plus tables.
Right.
But Markdown has acquired more features over the years in these things. I I think there's a lot more ahead for us to figure out in,
Right.
where do these well, actually it's funny because it's kind of going back to like the SGML minimization thing.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
perfectly fine with angle brackets. Markdown is obviously a sign that most people are not. SGML was well aware of this problem way back when.
Mm,
Um, but I don't feel like we've come to a solution yet. I think we're just kind of in this continual evolution where people use tools. They're good enough or they're frustrating. Eventually something else happens.
mm.
Something breaks off. I mean, my favorite something breaks off story is JSON, which is sort of an accident that's created inside of JavaScript. And Doug Crockford noticed this thing was there and we could do other things with it.
Mm.
And then weirdly, coincidentally, it almost lines up with YAML, which split
Oh,
off of
right.
the XML community long ago. So I think there's kind of a common set of things at the core of those, and we
Right.
keep reinventing them.
Yeah.
But I don't think we're done inventing them. So
No, 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 no. There's always seems to be room for another one, doesn't there? Yet another markup language. Um, I'm not sure if that was the joke built into the acronym for YAML, was it? Yet another
it
markup
was,
language.
and it came out of the simplified markup language stuff that split out of like the XML dev mailing list in 2000 or 2001, I think.
Right, 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 right. I'd be interested in your thoughts about because obviously you've spent a lot of time working in books and the digital proxies of books, and where we are now. Um, seems to me that I'm seeing things being done with what traditionally would have been called a book,
Mhm.
um, uh, that have no digital equivalent. So I'll give you an example that blew me away some months ago. Was one of the Google applications, Notebook LM. Yeah, Notebook LM. I
Yeah.
don't know if you've seen that, but I remember uploading a PDF document. It was an RFP, a public RFP that I uploaded to Notebook LM, and the first time I used it, it was it generated this audio summary of it was a two-person kind of podcast like we're having now, except
Right.
discussing the contents of that PDF. But then I revisited it a couple of months later, and it had sprouted this new capability that I could interrupt the conversation and ask questions about the document.
I have
And
not
that
yet interrupted, but I should.
that blew my mind because, I know there's no paper equivalent of that. I mean, it was pretty amazing to think that you could turn a document into a two-person podcast episode, but to think that you could take a document and turn it into a two-person podcast episode that you could then interrupt and basically, say, "Excuse me, could you explain that again?" Or "What about X?" Um, that really, that really blew me away, because it's just a brand new way of thinking about what digital document type content can be. Have you had any of those moments when I need to say I stuff, any stuff that's particularly impressed you?
I've had a lot of cases where generated content was more complete than I expected.
Hmm.
I think I've had better luck with generating content, even refining it, than I've had with summarizing and compressing. I have a fair amount of stuff where I'm trying to generate transcripts and the transcripts turn out all right. And my cat is very interested all of a sudden. Um, but when I go to summarize things, I have a lot more surprise repetition in the system than I'm used to. And I'm
Mm.
having to kind of filter those things out of it.
Right.
Um, I think the best experiences I've had were with a demo that a friend set up, which was this was about a year ago. I think Gemini was the LLM, but they were showing off all the ways that they were constraining it to get more focused results. And then you could compare that to what you'd get if you just had like vanilla Gemini.
Right.
And that whole focusing process was dramatically improving and made me much more comfortable. The other place where I've had that kind of experience, although maybe it's a little more over time, is on the coding side
Mm.
of generative AI. Um, we've always had autocomplete. We've always had, I used to work in Rails, which did a lot of code generation. Um, but this really made that more powerful, more accessible, more useful.
Mm.
Um, instead of, saying I have this structure, please go make me mocks for it, I could get variations on that. I could get all kinds of suggestions that went beyond kind of what I'd asked for. Um, I have a friend who's been complaining lately that when he uses Claude on code, Claude wants to change his unit tests rather than adhering to the unit tests, and that might be going a
Okay.
little too far.
Right.
It's one of those cute, but please not now kinds of
Right.
problems. Um, so I think, the zone where I'm really actively working with these things most right now is coding. Um,
Okay.
and the results there are just improving much faster than I would have expected.
Right.
Uh,
Right. Right.
so yeah.
And what do you think of, there's some pretty extreme uh projections about what this means for the job of being a traditional computer programmer out there. There are those who say that a whole bunch of that stuff is going to be, machine generated a lot sooner, perhaps, than we think.
So
What do you think?
fear I fear for the programmers who are like me, who are basically plumbers. I'd say 90% of the code that I've ever written is connect this thing to this process that I didn't
Hmm.
write. Um, you know, simple transformation workflows, moving stuff from one data source to a database. Um, all of that kind of stuff is just trivial to do with these. There are still things you need to know. I think it's really crucial to have the vocabulary to ask for things in ways that produce better results. And probably the most important part, which is something that has always been a problem in programming, is just evaluating the results and
Right.
knowing what went wrong. I mean, there are people who are generating code and then taking the stack traces from the error and running it back into the code. And you can kind of do that. It might work, but
Mm.
I wouldn't count on it for anything that has to last more than I need to use this today and then I'll throw it away.
Right.
Um, I think the skills of knowing how like test driven development works and how to apply tests are still going to be important. I think the kind of API development that really flowered as a result of the XML work we did
Mm.
is still going to be important. The tests on the one side and the APIs on the other kind of provide constraints that the
Right.
API, that the AI can look at and say, okay, I have to create code that fits within this
Right.
interface and matches these things. And much to my surprise, it can actually do these things.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
but if you just kind of say, make me an app that does this, your results might vary.
Yeah.
So a lot of coders' jobs are in trouble. I can't
Yeah. Yeah.
contest that. Um, at the same time, a core set of stuff is never going to go away.
Mm.
And a lot of this is kind of weird to say. A lot of the skills that we all should have learned as programmers, but rarely did, can keep our jobs relevant and important, even in this age of having the computer do more. Uh,
Right.
there's always the hope also that we'll simply create a lot more code. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
people will more efficiently generate more programs and better programs and that kind of thing. Um, that hasn't been the pattern I've seen in past waves of programming change. With Actually, maybe with one big exception. When programming became accessible enough to get out of the data center, um, there was an explosion in the number of programmers. But within companies, they're trying to look for efficiency, um, and not necessarily just keep creating more and more cool stuff.
Right,
It's
right,
it's a difficult tension. Um, if you're a plumber programmer like me, try to find other corners of programming
right.
that are more difficult to just swap
Yeah.
in and out. That would be my strong advice.
I mean, my 2 cents on it is, I mean, I'm looking at different, I suppose, thoughts that are out there in the news sphere about it, where all of this goes, and the idea, for example, prompt engineering as being its own discipline is
Mhm.
just an interesting one. But I really like the idea that, and you've kind of touched on it there, is that, from my own programming experience, one of the challenges with test-driven development um, has always been, under pressure to deliver functioning code. It's very easy to basically, you know, not put all the effort you could or should into the tests. So
Mhm.
the idea that programming could be basically giving the computer very rigorous definitions of success, right?
Yeah.
And having it find a way to get to something that will pass those success metrics is, to me, actually a really intriguing idea, which would actually increase the quality of software in spades. If that's the future, I'm all in.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And it also reminds me of something else important that we markup people did. Like I mentioned, the APIs that flowered after, XML made things seem more possible.
hmm,
One of the big things that markup did for that like protocol world was make all of those things more visible. They weren't just,
right,
flinging things on a wire. They were things you could keep around. They were things that you could have a language model review and
right,
analyze and see how these things go. Um, I think to a large extent, even though these systems aren't really built on markup as they're not markup systems, but the work that we did in the 90s and early 2000s is a lot of what makes it possible to create these kinds of applications with these new tools.
right, right, right. Yeah, I mean, I think everything's changing, but uh, I think there's reasons for hope about software engineering as a discipline.
There
Uh,
is. There are a lot of
it's just that it's not going to be the programming I grew up with, and my generation, your generation, right?
yeah.
That it's going to require, thinking about it differently. And but with that change, I think a bunch of very positive things could happen. I mean, it's never been. There's always been this, as you know, um, Groundhog Day thing. You mentioned the programming language, Crystal, was it, that
Yeah.
was like, trying to be like the C programming language. There comes a point where you kind of say, well, I mean, how many programming languages do we really need? Like endless reinvention of, something to do, say, kind of databasey type programming. Like, how many Ruby on Rails kind of things do we really need in the world? Um, so I like the idea that this whole thing we're going through at the moment might free up some brain cycles to think about some other things, in particular quality, ways in which we can drive um, improve productivity of programmers who are looking to really drive, very, very rigorous QA/QC.
Yeah.
Um,
And architectures that, can last for the duration and not just for this year's cycle.
yeah, that's definitely been a feature as well, hasn't it? That there's been, so much code. Was it Guido van Rossum of Python
Mhm.
said something like, he said, ship the prototype, I think was one of the phrases I heard him use,
Yeah.
and, and build one to throw away, because you will anyway. You know, it's there's that. It started off as a joke, ship the prototype, and then it became kind of the way things are done, because of course the world is evolving so fast. Companies are under pressure to move forward, 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 and in that type of environment, it's difficult, perhaps just not, not valuable to be thinking in terms of a, well, will this code be maintainable in 10 years time type horizon? Maybe you don't
Yeah.
have the luxury of thinking in terms of those horizons.
Yeah, I think it's less that the code we're generating today will be maintained, but that the bigger system it fits into
Right.
still persist in some form. That's I think why I get excited about APIs and
Right.
similar things. Those are I mean, you can generate those too. You can generate all of these pieces, but if
Right.
you have a stable API, you can generate clients for it. You can generate servers for it. You can code something specific against it. You have all of the
Right.
options because you have that single set of expectations.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
and I'm mostly thinking of this in terms of programming now, but similar things apply to document systems.
Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely.
it's
Yeah. Yeah.
that that structure, that backbone, that componentization.
What do you think about the whole idea that uh, of conversational user interfaces? I mean, do you think we're on the cusp of maybe a complete revisit of what seemed like such an amazing breakthrough at the time to me anyway? I remember was
Mhm.
seeing the first. Well, it was an Apple Lisa. It wasn't the Apple Macintosh, the original Apple Lisa.
Yep.
And then, of course, that ended up going over to Microsoft with Microsoft Windows. It seems to me that, from those days, what Microsoft is 50 years old now, I think.
Yeah.
Um,
That's a Friday. Yeah.
Something like that. But basically that was when, that very first um Windows icons, mouse pointer thing has kind of, been the center of this whirlwind that we've all been in for so long. And I think we might be about reaching the end of it. I think we're moving on to something which is not based on Windows icons, mice, and pointers.
I think we're moving beyond the Windows icons, mouse pointer model WIMP, I
Yeah.
think it is.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
at the same time, and maybe this is just that my brain is getting older. Um, I think one of the things that I love about that interface is that you have constant reminders of your context and what you're doing.
Right.
So, I mean, when you start with a blank page, it's okay, but the conversational models, when they're still on screen, when you're chatting back and forth, you can always just go back and see what you did. Um, but as you get into more voice interactions and other kinds of interactions, there's a lot there about just trying to remember your context.
Uh,
Um, we also see this with things like touchscreen interfaces in cars and where was that thing? How do I get back to that thing? Oh, I'm driving at the same time. Um, whereas my somewhat broken old car, I can tell at a glance what my context is. I'm not having to keep
mm,
that state in my own head. Um, so I think we're going to end up with some kind of a combination where it's not just, I'm talking to the computer, but there is a uh, visual or other context to it. It just won't all
right.
be visual. It won't be that kind of blending seems like a good thing to me.
Right.
Uh, but I don't know. There seem to be a lot of people right now who are very obsessed with chat in ways that would exclude all the other pieces,
Right.
and especially just like talking to pins or phones or whatever. Um, and I don't know. I'm comfortable doing that with people. Obviously, I don't mind conversation,
Right.
but for these more kind of project driven things, I like seeing where I'm at and how these things are
Yeah.
going.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And one of the things I like about uh the co-pilot paradigm, I don't know who originally
Mhm.
came up with the phrase co-pilot, is that idea that the context is on the left hand side of my screen.
Yes.
The chat I'm having with the computer is on the right hand side of my screen. I don't have to tell the computer what I'm working on because it's on the left hand side of the screen.
Right.
You know, seems to address at least some of those context
Yeah.
challenges that you're addressing. But it doesn't mean that AutoCAD is going away or Microsoft Word is going away
No,
or
no.
web browsers are going away.
Yeah, I think we're going to end up with a very mixed world over the next 10 years as we sort out what this means. I
Yeah.
honestly don't know that we've even taken the GUI paradigm as far as it can go.
Okay.
Um, I know, Engelbart 68, Xerox, all of these things.
Mm.
And every website right now seems to look the same, which is a little depressing, but
Mm.
um, there's still more experimentation there too, that we could do. Um, I hope one of the things that I hope is that as we take away the plumbing that I'm usually working on, that it'll be possible to focus on, okay, I want to do something different here.
Right.
It's a little tricky because I know most of these AI systems are built on analyzing existing patterns and extracting things from that. But maybe we can find corners where we just are like, okay, I just want this to look different. I've been doing these things on paper, maybe, and can I do that over here? I've been doing these
Right.
things in a different kind of system. Can I do that?
Do you
So,
buy into the whole virtual reality, augmented reality thing? Do you think that's gonna would
not
that
very
be the next step
strongly,
from
but
GUIs?
part of that is because I'm very easily motion sick.
Okay.
I was very happy to try a very expensive virtual reality set a few years ago and not be motion sick. Um, but I don't know, maybe I'm too connected to the physical world. Um, I have friends who do all kinds of things in it, creating stuff and consuming stuff. It's definitely compelling for a lot of people.
Hmm.
Um, I think it could also end up as part of this blend.
Right.
Um, some of the augmented reality stuff certainly were, I mean, it seems like a 1970s sci-fi movie, but you're seeing things added to your world. I think that is probably more plausible because it doesn't cut us off from
Right.
everything else. Um, again, I think I like the mixtures rather than the
Yeah.
dive into one approach.
It's funny, we mentioned the longevity of some old stuff and some of the old stuff that were done in the markup days. And one of the things that I think um kind of goes along with that whole journey, right? If you're going to try and capture the semantics of anything, right? It's giving things names. Right. So
Yeah.
even like so probably one of the most powerful but also the most boring thing on the planet, is probably a barcode, you know.
Yeah.
Except in this new era, all of a sudden barcodes now are, they're not just for point of sale terminals or whatever. There's like I can now point my phone at anything with a barcode or a QR code
Yeah.
and potentially have a whole wealth of context information pop up in front of me. I mean, I did it recently with a tube of toothpaste and
Yeah.
ended up having a conversation with an AI about what was in the toothpaste.
This has
Um,
been this has been key for accessibility for me as my eyesight gets worse because
right,
the small QR code still works for my phone, and then I can just get to a bigger version, and that's all I wanted. So,
right, right,
yeah.
right.
And they're also, you can use that. We have some statues in Ithaca that we put in a couple of years ago, and on the plaques for them is a QR code, and you can scan that, and in one case, you can hear the person talk about their experiences, and another, you can hear, recorded speeches because they died 40 years ago. Um, and, they're hyperlinks. I mean, these are really just hyperlinks that we've made do things, and QR codes are frequently just URLs, but
Right,
um,
right, right, right.
it's good to have that connectivity. I was a little shy of it for a long time because I somewhere in my attic I do have a QCat. I remembered this vision where we were all going to be scanning barcodes and did not find it workable, but it's better now.
Right, 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 right. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Are we going to carry the word document with us for the next 10 or 20 years, you think? I mean, I know we've carried the word page with us a lot, because we've got, we've had PDFs that are pages, we've got HTML, which was pages. Um,
I think we're going to carry the words, but they're going to become more metaphorical.
right.
Um, I think like half the time now when I hear chapter, I mean, granted, I'm not working on books as often anymore. It's like a chapter in someone's life or a page in someone's life. Um,
Okay.
I don't think that usage will ever go away. I think we have that in the language in many different ways.
Mm,
I do have a lot of sort of weird philosophical things that came out of single page applications and the way that like warps what pages are
right.
that bigger sense. And actually, there's been finally a fair amount of backlash to SPAs in the last couple of years, looking at the way that changed the way that we were building all of our applications, and it was not
Mm.
always a good idea. Um, Sometimes multiple pages is a good thing. Um, but documents, I think documents specifically are going to get an even stronger version of that metaphorical meaning, even as the paper and the forms and the pieces disappear.
Right.
I mean, I just filled out passport applications. That was a very structured form of document. Um, I see a lot more things circulating around legal documents and what they mean or don't mean. Um, I think the concept of filings is still really important.
Hmm.
The collection of things that you bring in, the collection of documents and other things. Um, I do frequently see things like sound files and images referred to as documents, which is
Right, right, right,
casual usage, but tells me something is happening.
right,
Uh,
right,
and I love the fact that like video and film, there's always been documentary, document,
right, right, right.
so even in that zone, I think it's something that is really tightly bound into at least literate culture
Right.
and permeates all that we do. Is it a well-formed, valid XML document? Well, that's a different question. I don't
Right,
know.
right, 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 right. Yeah, there's no it's been just every 5 or 6 years in it feels as if it's been every 5 or 6 years for my entire career. There's been some major thing that's happened. And here we go again.
Yes.
It's interesting to see, what parts get carried forward, what parts get left behind, what parts get carried forward, uh, and are still known as we know them today. What parts get carried forward but get renamed, you know?
Mhm.
So, uh, like Agent would be, I think, a great example. I think, um, those of us of a certain era who remember on Unix machines things called cron jobs, right? Basically running things in the background.
Yep.
Uh, um, I think that idea of the machine doing something in the background, I think, is about to get reblessed as renamed as agent. Like anything that's asynchronously happening. I asked it to do something, and it'll come back to me when it's finished, or it'll be there for me when I go looking for it again. I think is now going to be an agent. But I think that happens with every major revolution. Is good stuff gets carried forward, perhaps renamed. Um, what do you think about the chunk versus component thing? I've always struggled with that idea of what to call these things. And at various times in my career and the folks that I've worked with over the decades, we've built systems that were basically chunk management systems. And
Right.
I've used component content management. I've heard minimum revisable unit used, MRU. I've used that UOI, a unit of information, like the smallest chunk of stuff that you know has a sufficient context that you know what it is, right, without having
Mhm.
to see what came before or what came after it, right? Um, what do you think is going to happen in the terminology battles for that stuff? Do you
I
think the
mean,
word component wins?
I think the word component probably becomes more specialized.
Okay,
In my own mind, components have clean-ish boundaries. They
okay,
don't always, and this may be a side effect of my coming up through object-oriented programming. Um, Boundaries that can connect to other things, certainly, but there's at least a defined boundary there.
hmm.
Um, Chunks, I tend to think of as more like a random selection. Um, I mean, once I started thinking about it, it just kind of blew my mind that in Microsoft Word, you could, select half of this section, the headline for the next section, and then, two paragraphs into the next one and just cut, copy, paste, whatever, without it going, but that was my structure. How did you do that? There was a time when you could do like vertical selection in it. That really just completely blew my mind, but I don't think that works anymore. That was definitely a chunk out of the middle. Right now, I feel like the world is more oriented towards chunks and breaking boundaries and not
Right.
having, as clean, a disciplined model as I
Right.
would frequently like. Um, I think, honestly, I think a lot of the things in computing are changing. Like for years, we've been very obsessed with our software being deterministic.
Mm.
The same thing goes in, you get the same thing out. Users will mess with that because they'll put different things in and claim it's the same thing and all of these things. But the basic idea was very stable.
Mhm.
And now, especially with LLMs, but also with other similar forms of computation, we're just having to accept that we get different results on different runs from the
Right, right.
same content. One of my friends had to keep running the same prompt 14 times to record an error message that he really wanted to be able to show people. And, it only came up sometimes, but it was important.
Right,
Um,
right, right, right.
I think I grew up in an era where even though I started out creating wretched spaghetti code, the prescription for making things better in computing was always to have sharper boundaries and know how these
Right.
pieces fit and be able to pull them apart. And all of the trends of the last few years seem to be going the
Yeah.
opposite direction.
Yeah. No, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I, it first dawned on me that we were entering into a different world when I saw my first web page that had a CGI script in it.
Yes.
Um, because then all of a sudden it was, well, I'm looking at that page at that URL. You're looking at that page at that URL. There's no guarantee that we're both looking at the same thing.
Yeah.
Uh, is essentially it made it was, I guess, a very early example of a dynamic web
Yep.
experience, you know. But with that dynamism comes all sorts of power to do with personalizations and so on, which are all, laudable unto themselves. But this side effect of a bit of an epistemic crisis about, well, what actually is on the front page of the newspaper, the online newspaper today? Because if I click on it and you click on it, we're going to
Yeah.
potentially get different things. It does seem to be. Some have called it the epistemic crisis or something of our times. That it's becoming really, really hard to lock down anything in digital form because it may well look different for you or I.
Mhm.
Um, and I think all sorts of great things can come from that, but some not so great things can come from it too.
There's a lot of creativity and price discrimination right now, for example. Yes.
Right, right, right.
Yeah. I mean, my favorite is when I'm trying to use a phone to navigate where an item is in a store, and I get there and the price is different on my phone and on the shelf. And the shelf price is the real price when you're in the store, but the phone price is the real price if you order it. And
Right, 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 right.
if I'm comfortable now with these not being the same, I've come to expect it. But if you'd done this to me 20 years ago, I would have been like, what just happened? So
Right, right,
yeah,
right, right.
all these pieces are melting.
Yeah, which in a weird way brings us all the way back to where we started in this conversation when we talked about CD-ROMs. Back in the good old days with the CD-ROM, you could just pick the one off the shelf.
Yeah.
And what it said 6 months ago is what it's going to say today when you put it into the computer.
Yeah.
Um, it's a different,
Somewhat Biotic is a 1995 CIA World Factbook CD-ROM, and
right, right, right,
that'll be
right.
all about the world as the CIA saw it in 1995.
1995. Yeah, 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 yeah. Well, Simon, it's been an absolute pleasure catching up with you and
It's been great.
talking today. And always good to do these trips down memory lane, especially with someone who's got the depth of experience that you have. And it's always a pleasure. And let's go on another one of those geek cruises sometime soon.
There are similar things that still exist, but I don't think they're looking for us as speakers.
No,
Said
no, no.
it's great to go to have this conversation with somebody else who's seen these changes and felt these changes and kind of sees where we're going. It's good.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you very much, Simon. Okay.
Thank you.
Talk to you again soon.